Shabbat Shalom, everyone. For those who have been following along over these last number of weeks, we have concluded the book of Bereshit, and today we begin the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And what's interesting to note is that the arc of the story takes some very interesting directions as we transition from the end of Genesis into the beginning of Exodus. If we think about the book of Bereshit, the arc is sort of this U, right? We start with creation, and then we start to fall lower and lower, right? We do have moments of peaks, but the struggles that we have with the Akedah, with the binding of Isaac, the struggles that we have with the family dynamics that are going on, kind of take the book of Bereshit down. Certainly when we get to the story of Joseph, right? We see Joseph, that's what we've been talking about these last number of weeks, and yet at the end of the book of Genesis, we end on this high note, right? Yes, we end with the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph. That's normal in terms of the life, but we end on this high note. And I've been kind of marking time through Genesis this year with the Andrew Lloyd Webber's Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Last week was that majestic choral, and Jacob came to Egypt no longer feeling old, and Joseph came to meet him in a chariot of gold, right? That's that moment that we had at the end. And then we have this strange transition. Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael, and these are the names of the children of Israel. So it connects us directly back into the book of Bereshit. As a matter of fact, the Vav that is there, Ve'ele, is something that all the rabbis pick up on as being unusual. And why does the and need to be there if it's the beginning of the book? Because it's actually connecting us back to the end of the book of Genesis. And it lists these names, and then as we turn to page 318, we see it turn very quickly. And this amazing high point of Joseph being the number 2 of the Jews living in the land of Egypt on a dime turns. And it turns with a single verse, verse 8. Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim, asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And that one verse changes everything. And the question is, and the rabbis really struggle over it, what does this verse mean? What does this verse mean? Is it to be taken literally, or is it to be taken figuratively? I don't know. Let's think about this for a little bit. What could this verse mean? If we were to take it literally, okay, there is a new king that took over from the one who knew Joseph. Now, by the way, the Egyptians were one of the best cultures at maintaining records. We see the hieroglyphics, we see all of that all over the place. So the fact that he didn't know Joseph is already problematic. But what might it mean if it weren't being taken in a literal sort of way?
I think there's a difference. There are two words, like when you know somebody, then there's ladat and lahakir. And when you say, like, yodea, like somebody, it's a lot more intimate. There's more intimacy with that particular word. And also, dat is knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So not only did he not have really knowledge of him, not only did he not have, he had no intimate relationship, like familiar relationship whatsoever at that point, but he also didn't really have knowledge. Like it just kind of got diluted.
So so Diana's bringing an interesting point, which is there are actually two words in Hebrew that we use for knowing somebody. Lada'at, right, is it speaks to intimacy. It actually literally speaks to intimacy in the Bible when it comes to, a man and a woman and knowing one another, right? But that's not what it means, obviously, in this case. What it means in this case is knowing, right, knowing that the person firsthand, personally, as opposed to lahakir or hakara, which probably better would be translated as to recognize, right? I recognize this person, right? I don't know Abraham Lincoln, but I recognize Abraham Lincoln, right? I recognize who he was, what he did. I know the history. Okay. Yes, Mark.
Another interpretation could be to understand someone's motivation. To know someone is to know their motivation. So if he was a foreigner to begin with, I don't know what his motivation was to do what he did, even though he saved Egypt. Was it for his own people? Was it for political motivation?
So Mark is arguing, I think, which is powerful, that to know somebody also can refer to knowing their motivation. That the first Pharaoh knew Joseph's motivation, and maybe now that motivation isn't quite so clear. Why did Joseph come here? Why did all these things happen the way that they did? Okay. Anybody else? Please. Right. Right. It is a way to say that whatever arrangement that was had with Joseph no longer pertained to what's going on here. Good. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a xenophobia that sort of occurs in this, right? And we see that actually in the very next verse as we look at it. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting us and rise from the ground." So they took taskmasters over them and they oppressed them with forced labor. So we see this transition, and whether it's the same king or a different king is less relevant, although it's a classic debate between Rav and Shmuel in the Talmud, right? One said literally he was new, the other said his decrees became new. So something happened that the Jewish people flourished, they became numerous, which seems to indicate that maybe a period of time has passed, because otherwise it would have just been that initial group that everybody recognized. But all of a sudden now, the Pharaoh looks at the people of Israel and said, wait a second, this is a potential threat. This is a potential problem. And thus begins the story of the slavery, which leads us ultimately to the Exodus. Now, our tradition says there are 400 years that we were enslaved. And so where that is in this process, how long were we there, how long, that's still up for debate, but the period of time actually then lasted a very long time once this decree took effect until we left Egypt as free people. I want to look at what's going on here because the tragedy of this story is actually not in the slavery. The tragedy of the story is from the amnesia, whether, self-induced or otherwise, right? The fact that Pharaoh said, I don't know these people. I'm not willing to recognize all of the good that Joseph did for Egypt, right? Joseph didn't just save his own family from the famine. Joseph saved Egypt from the famine. That's why he was made Pharaoh's number 2. All of the good that Joseph did was forgotten. And Rashi picks up on it, and Shemot Rabbah picks up on it, and it becomes less relevant whether or not it was the same king or a different king, but the history, everything that Joseph did, was now being erased, actively erased. Rashi says, and this is citing the Talmud, who did not know means he made himself as if he didn't know him. He knew him. He knew of Joseph. He knew of everything that he did. But he decided to ignore that because that didn't fit with the narrative of the threat that was now forming with the Jewish people. Shemot Rabbah follows up and says, all the good that Joseph did for Egypt, it was as if Pharaoh didn't know. This, let's pretend that we don't know. Let's pretend that we don't owe them anything, that we don't owe Joseph anything, is actually the lesson here that is eternal. Because it's hard for us as Jews, even though we try every single year at Passover time, to put ourselves back into slavery. It's a hard thing to do, right? We eat the bitter herbs, we tell the story, we do those things, but do we truly know what it means to be an oppressed people? Do we truly know what it means to be slaves in that way? Most of us living in the United States in the 21st century do not. But this verse actually speaks to us much more clearly and much more loudly as we start to think about this recurring human script of, we don't remember you. We don't remember what you did for us. And actually, not only do we not remember the good that you did, but you're dangerous. So we have no choice but to oppress you, to do all of those sorts of things. Are we starting to hear some echoes of this that have now occurred throughout history? There's something that is particularly and painfully Jewish here in this story. It has been retold age after age, time and again. And there are moments in our history where the Jews flourish and serve and build and heal and teach and defend, whether it be in the present day, whether it be in, times past in the golden age of Spain, right before the Holocaust, all of these sorts of things where all of a sudden that is just erased. It's just erased. And not only does it become erased, but then we become the threat. regardless of what Jews contributed to the society in Germany, it was irrelevant when it came to the Holocaust. And we're beginning to hear those echoes again, as we as Jews are being told we can't participate in these things anymore, that we have in some cases created and formed and built. We're being put to the outside. We as Jews are founders in terms of civil rights and human rights and equality and those sorts of things. And yet, when we try to participate in those activities, we're told, well, no, we can't anymore. That's not a place for us anymore. That forgetfulness is starting to happen again. We're starting to feel that again. And it's what is most alarming about what we see in the world today. Pharaoh's sin, his first sin in this telling, is not the slavery, but it's the deliberate murder of gratitude, right? The deliberate saying, I'm going to forget all of that because it doesn't fit my narrative. It doesn't fit what I would like to see. And coming back to the question of da'at, right? To know is intimate. To know, it's relationship, right? To say that he didn't know Joseph is to say that he is refusing that relationship. And that is precisely what we as Jews are called to be the opposite of. The book of Shemot is the birth of people whose identity is actually rooted in memory. We remember slavery. We remember redemption. We remember the stranger because we were strangers. We remember Shabbat because creation itself is a memory that we rehearse weekly, right? These are things that memory is integral to who we are as a Jewish people. It is how we work. It is how we operate. It is how we transmit our values from one generation to the next generation. And so today, as we're watching this ancient tactic come alive again, we're told to forget. Forget the role that Jews have played in building societies, universities, medicine, culture, civil rights, to forget what happens when anti-Semitism is minimized rather than confronted early. Don't worry about it. It's just a phase. It's just a few people. It's not a big deal. And then once that forgetting actually takes place, that's when the language shifts. And Jews are reframed not as neighbors, but as problems. Not as contributors, but as obstacles. Not as people with a history, but as a category that can just be dismissed. Pharaoh doesn't begin by enslaving. He begins by saying, I don't know Joseph. I don't want to know Joseph. And as we hear that same refrain echo today, it should make us all stand up and listen and fight for that relationship, for that da'at, for that knowledge of who we are, what we've done, and what our connection really truly is to this world. Shabbat Shalom.